Okay, good morning, everyone. And we're going to begin the session. And my name is Natalia Isupova again, and I'm with OLI. And today's topic is very exciting. We're going to be learning from post-traumatic growth, what are the lessons learned and how to get to the desired outcomes, what are those outcomes, and what does it have to do with today's situation. And I am honored and excited to have Dr. Nigel Girgrah with me and Greg Hebert. And we'll do a little more introductions down the road. And I also would like to welcome all of you behind the screen. We are very, very honored and happy and excited for you to be coming back. And we'd like to welcome everyone who is coming back, and we would like to welcome new participants. And we hope you find it as useful as previous sessions. I also would like to thank you so much for your gracious and kind words and comments in the survey that you provide after each session. Those are very, very truly inspirational for us, and they make us, continue working and do the best for you. So once again, today's session is lessons learned from post-traumatic growth. And we have 5 sessions so far, and this project has been a collaboration between the Office of Professional Wellbeing and all of the 5 sessions on resiliency, nutrition, mindfulness, staying active, and the maintaining healthy relationships could be found in OLN. And we will also provide those links for you in the one-pager after the session for easier access. And if you didn't have a chance to attend in person, you can still watch those and hopefully learn something. The next session that's coming up after this one is going to happen in 2 weeks, not next week. We're going to be taking one break due to the scheduling issues, and it's going to be around sleeping tightly. We're going to have a physician from the Ochsner Sleep Lab, and he's going to talk to us about some of the misconceptions about sleeping habits, what works, what doesn't work, what do we know from the studies and research, and what are actually some fads that we all go to every now and then. So again, today's agenda, we're going to stick to the same structure that we've been doing before. We're going to have the interview, and then during the interview, we're going to be rolling out a couple of polling questions. Those are anonymous, and please, we invite everyone to participate. Those are fun. And you can use Q&A functionality of the webinar to submit your questions as we go through the interview. If you have a question around the topic that is being discussed, please hover over like at the bottom of your screen, and the menu should slide up, and you should be able to click the Q&A pod and submit your question. If you have technical questions, please submit them in the chat. So I have Brendan Moore behind the screen who is working, and he is answering your technical questions in the chat. So also remember that you can upvote the questions, or in other words, like the questions that someone already posted. So you have this, everyone knows this like button. So just like the question, that way we will know that more people are seeking answers to the question. So that's, with that, let me stop sharing the presentation and jump to my guests. And once again, so I'm gonna introduce Dr. Nigel Girgrah. And welcome back. We already had him for the resiliency session, the very first session. And Dr. Girgrah is the Chief Wellness Officer at Ochsner. And I will let him introduce our guest.
Thanks, Natalia. Totally excited to be here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Greg Hebert. Greg is a leadership consultant, an executive coach, and an author of the book, You Can't Give What You Don't Have. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy and holds an MBA at Harvard Business School. He has worked extensively with many organizations, including Ochsner Health. And for the past 1.5 years, he has been my leadership coach and has helped me enormously, both personally and professionally. During many of our conversations over the past year, we've talked about the subject of post-traumatic growth, a subject I know Greg has studied quite a bit. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, I know we will talk about post-traumatic growth. But first, if we think of COVID as being, in this case, the traumatic event, we know pre-traumatic event in terms of mental health, we weren't really in a good place to start off. Do you want to comment on that a little bit, Greg, before we introduce the subject?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Girgrah. I think to set the stage, if you look at some of the most up-to-date data regarding depression, suicide rates, it's estimated in 2017 that the rate of depression was 12 times higher than it was in America in 1960. Certainly, that's moderated by we've made it more acceptable. But the average age of depression in 1960 was almost 30, and today it's estimated it's somewhere around 12. One of the sad statistics that I could only pull data from 2017 is we had almost 50,000 suicides in America and over 1.4 million assists in terms of tries. And then what we would call the best and the brightest in America are college students. In a survey by the American Healthcare College Association, 52% of college students in 2018 reported feeling hopelessness, and 39% of them gave symptoms of depression. So I think if you look even before COVID-19, it was clear that we as a society were not healthy. Many of us are lonely, miserable, and in not the most positive state of being.
Yeah, and it seems what's kind of unique about COVID-19, unlike some of the other crises we've gone through, is it's both a discrete and an ambiguous threat. But where are we now, do you think, Greg, in terms of uncertainty? And what factors contribute to our stress and this experience of trauma?
Yeah, I actually think we're going into, the military has a wonderful acronym that they use to describe a very chaotic, difficult operating battle environment. They call it VUCA, V-U-C-A, where V stands for volatility, U stands for uncertainty, C stands for complexity, and A stands for ambiguity. So if you just take, I coach a elementary school principal, and we actually had a coaching call this morning, and she was commenting on the guidelines issued again yesterday by the CDC of what it's going to take to operate our schools. And all she could say to me is, I have no idea how we're going to do that. So you think about the uncertainties of bringing back our country to some semblance of normal. And many of us just don't know the state of testing, the state of tracing, how safe do you have to make it? Think about opening a restaurant, which the city of New Orleans is so dependent upon. And most of the answers that leaders really have at this point in time is, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, I think you've got a great schematic. I don't know if you want to bring up.
Sure.
I love this. Do you want to just maybe, this helped me a lot. Do you want to just sort of discuss?
Sure. And I'll make it real that on March 7th, I was sitting in the economy class of a Delta aircraft in the Atlanta airport when I get a text from Mike Holefeld saying essentially Ochsner's closed to visitors, especially providers like me. And I picked my suitcase out of the overhead and walked off the plane, and people were shocked and surprised. So, I have felt acutely, as so much of my work is with healthcare providers, and just between Ochsner and the other clients that I serve, they have suffered well over, $1 billion worth of economic losses in March, April, and May. So I would share with you authentically that there have been, especially in those early days of March, tremendous amounts of internal fear of what's this going to mean for the work that I do and I've been privileged to do for the last 20 years. And so, I've had to sort of work my own demons. And so for me, it was being able to sort of visualize moving out of a place of fear in inside, as well as what I communicated to others, and move into how do I use this time to learn, to possibly adapt, to possibly be a better version of myself, But ultimately, what has been for me the most important thing in my journey is even shifting out of that learning zone to how can I be my best self in service to others, in support of what is for many of us a very debilitating, unstabilizing, and challenging psychologically, physically, and emotionally time in our lives. So I hope this.
I'd even add that now is even more challenging for some than it was sort of mid-March. I mean, I think mid-March, at least for some of the healthcare providers I work with, there was sort of it was like a jolt of caffeine, a clarity of what we're doing. And I think now as we, kind of recover a bit, there's even more uncertainty. And I think the schematic is, equally valid today, next month, as it was in March and April.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is it's not necessarily linear. There'll be moments of our days and our nights, just given our own unique set of circumstances of loved ones who may be affected, family members who are out of work, parents just tired of having to homeschool, and some places in our country have already made the decision not to open up in the fall. So, I view this sort of schematic as, that there may be moments of great contribution, but I cycle back to that fear as I wrestle with, some great challenge in my own family's history and struggle.
This may be a good time to bring up the first polling question.
Sure.
I just want, I know we've got a number of participants in the audience, and maybe just get a sense of where everybody is today. Do they primarily identify with being in the fear zone, the learning zone, or in the contribution zone? We'll open it up.
Yeah, it's going, we're at 30%, so it takes usually a few seconds, and I will share the results in a few seconds. So we have 239 participants today. That's great. And we usually have about 80% people voting. So we're at 73 right now. I'll give it a few more seconds. And I'll let you react to that. Okay. And let me and share results. Okay.
That's interesting. So 11% fear zone, about 6 out of 10 in the learning zone, and about 3 out of 10 folks in the contribution zone. I saw somebody comment that, and it sort of gets to Greg's point, that they're in different zones at different times of the day. And I think that just gets back to the fact that this is really sort of binary. It's fluid within individuals, within teams, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that. Any comments, Greg?
Yeah, a recent book I read chronicled Winston Churchill's leadership from May of 1940 to May of 1941 of Britain during a time when the Germans were attacking almost every day. London actually experienced almost 60 days straight of being bombed. And many psychologists predicted that the psychological trauma on the citizens of London in particular would be so vast, and it just actually didn't happen. And so I have a prediction, as I've spoken and tried to stay in touch with many Ochsner leaders, that your organization is uniquely set up to actually withstand and excel and soar and thrive in the midst of a crisis like COVID-19, certainly because of your history. Katrina was one of your greatest moments as an organization, and still, as I talk to leaders, there is such a deep sense of pride of how the organization flourished in that difficult time when many other health systems failed and folded. So you have a history of being able to go through hard times, but also the clear and present danger. No one has faced COVID-19 as closely and fiercely as Ochsner, and done it with tremendous grace and dignity and pride, all I hear from your colleagues is just this deep sense of how everybody has stepped up in amazing and incredible ways. And so part of today is to reflect on that you're already experiencing this thing called post-traumatic growth, but also to maybe set the foundation for some more inoculation, because I think that the next 12 to 18 months are going to be differently. The clear and present danger may not be as close, but we're all going to be wrestling with the economic uncertainties as well as the healthcare uncertainties. Do we have a second wave? What does that mean? If schools don't open, what does that mean? If daycare, we can't get places for our kids to go, and so parents can get back to work, what does that mean? So I guess I see that the future uncertainty may be even greater than the past, just given all of the things we still don't know.
Yeah. So maybe we can then get to the heart of the discussion today. We've already mentioned the term post-traumatic growth. Greg, maybe you can define it, tell us when it was first described,
Yeah.
and how does it relate to what we're currently experiencing?
So a quick intro of how I became very, very interested in this concept, even before it was named a concept. So when I was 19, the United States Military Academy sent me off to the Naval Academy with 5 other classmates to be exchange cadets for a semester. And in the fall of 1979, there were about 7 staff and faculty who had been former POWs from Vietnam, to include the superintendent, to include James Stockdale, who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his senior leadership in North Vietnam, as well as my battalion tactical officer. And so I got to hear these men speak about their torture, about their experiences, about their abuse, about the difficulty of the journey. But what caught my imagination was the universal sense of enlightenment and wisdom that I heard these men reflect on and share. And even at 19, I had the good sense of hoping that I didn't have to go through what they had experienced to get the kind of enlightenment and wisdom that I was so impressed with. So I actually went back to the West Point after my semester was up, and I convinced the commandant to actually create a speaker series for the next 10 years for West Point, to bring back a former POW to talk about the transformational experience they went through. And since 1973, when they were repatriated, they have been studied extensively by the military to see what we could learn from what they went through and endured. It wasn't until 1995 that 2 professors from the University of North Carolina actually came up with the phrase post-traumatic growth. And their entry into that field was they were studying parents who had lost young children. And what they were studying was this phenomena of looking at how these parents had taken such a devastating, colossal, immense loss and were able to turn it into something profoundly powerful. And so those 2 professors began to sort of see this phenomena called post-traumatic growth, and they described it as positive and profound transformation that people experience by struggling through, an immense personal crisis or traumatic event. What they described the outcomes of post-traumatic growth as 5 clear qualities and characteristics. The first being that in order to make the most out of trauma and crisis, you had to see it as something making meaning in your life, that you came out of the experience with a deeper sense of meaning of what was important. Secondarily, you had a sense that relationships really mattered, and you were able to sort of deepen your level of empathy for others. Third, as you probably spoke of in your first session on resilience, that there was this deep renewed strength that if I got through that, I can get through anything. And then the fourth quality was just a keener appreciation for life. When that life has been threatened, you begin to sort of appreciate and reflect that appreciation. And fifth, the most important outcome was when you'd survived and been transformed by this experience of trauma and crisis, you came at it with a renewed sense of faith and belief system. And as one of the slides that you showed, why this POW group is so profound is of the 591 that came back, they have done extensive studies that less than 3% of them, 4% of them have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you go back to the Korean War, World War II, Holocaust survivors, usually those rates of post-traumatic stress are somewhere around 70 to 90%. So if you just look at this group of men to say, why didn't they experience such severe stress and depression, and what allowed them to come out of that experience with these remarkably prosperous, productive, and incredibly happy lives? And so that's what got me so excited about this work on post-traumatic growth. And I believe we can learn so much from the practices of what they went through and what they did on a routine basis. And I wish the term wasn't even post-traumatic growth. I wish it was traumatic growth, because I think the lives of these POWs reflected that even before they got released from captivity, they had done a tremendous amount of interpersonal work and collective community work on themselves, so that when they came out of this experience, they were very different from when they went in as much younger men.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I want to get your advice on something you just mentioned, which is sort of a key element of this, and that's cultivating positivity. It's kind of easy to sort of say, it's an attitude, but sometimes we're wired to, for a default position of negativity. I'm sure there's some physiological explanation for that. We go into defense mode, fight versus flight. But maybe you can give us, or give some of us, a little bit of a playbook, or what sort of things can help cultivate.
There's all of this wonderful neuroscience and work in psychology around the profoundness and the importance of cultivating more positive emotion. And there's a term that I often see out in literature today called life hacks. So what we're learning, just how the brain functions, is that when I am in a negative downward spiral, which is much more natural for human beings. I think it's wired in our DNA to have a negativity bias. That's how you survive. That's how you stay alive. We did not pass our DNA on. If we died, if I went out into the bushes and said, "Oh, how marvelous, the bushes are moving. I wonder what's there," right? So the person who figured out that there was a lethal threat there and ran away, lived a lot longer. So I think to recognize that we have this inherent negativity bias. It's natural. We look for what's wrong. We look for things to fix. And it's a wonderful quality, and there's a lot of goodness from it. But I often think about a young soldier who just came off the battlefield in Afghanistan, who stayed alive by having this negativity bias and being hypervigilant, and then goes back to his home or her home, where they have left their spouse with 2 young kids, and the 2-year-old drops a glass. And if that young soldier hasn't been reconditioned for a positivity bias, their reactions can be, pretty damaging. And so Martin Seligman, the guy who's known as the father of positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, he was the one who coined this frame that we have to equally condition ourselves to hunt for the good, just as an equal measure to how we're wired to hunt for the bad. And so if you think about how do I create an upward spiral, there's numerous and multiple ways. I'm going to talk about engaging in a spirit of gratitude. I'm going to talk about, having a picture where, Nigel, you're having a family experience where when you look at that picture, it takes you back to that moment of time where you, had great bliss and happiness. As long as I've been giving talks on my book, I always show a picture of my wife and I standing at this beach in St. Lucia on our 25th wedding anniversary. And, it was one time in my life where I got it right. And whenever I look at that picture, it evokes joy and happiness. They say laughter is the greatest medicine. And so finding ways to laugh at the difficulty and the challenges of our time is another life hack. So whatever you find that can cultivate you being positive, upbeat, enthusiastic, there's just tremendous research that successful marriages, successful teams, successful anything is predicated on a positive to negative ratio of almost 5.5 positive interactions to 1 negative. And there's been research that have looked at failed marriages that on average, their positive to negative is 0.363 to 1. So for every 1 positive interaction, there's 3 negative interactions. So it helps us not only build deeper relationships, there's tremendous research that said it actually fuels longevity and longer lives.
You mentioned Martin Seligman, and he wrote Flourish, and as he said, he's the sort of grandfather of positive psychology. He talks a lot about expressions of gratitude and gratitude journals. Is there any science behind that? Because so I see some roll their eyes when I mention it, or maybe just talk a bit about that.
He probably has the most extensive database where he will give, in his master's degree, and now he teaches a PhD in positive psychology, he will actually administer a pretty well-known statistical reliable assessment on one's happiness set point. And in the coursework he will have you engage in gratitude exercises. One of the exercises he has you do is to think of someone who has greatly impacted your life in a profound positive way, who may be still living, and write that person a letter and the impact they've had on your life, and then deliver that letter, that note to that person, and watch and see what happens. And what his research has been able to show is people's happiness set point of engaging in a practice of frequent and habitual gratitude actually changes our actual set point of how we experience life.
I know somebody who, talking about positivity, you've talked to me a lot about Viktor Frankl and this, between a stimulus and a response, there's a space, and there's an opportunity to choose where we're going to go. Do you want to maybe talk briefly about him and what he experienced?
Yeah. I think his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that he wrote in 1946, as a reflection of what he had observed and experienced at Auschwitz, is nothing less than one of the most extraordinary books ever written. One of the greatest leadership self-help books is by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders. And if you open that book up, the first paragraph cites Viktor Frankl, and just about everybody who's in this field does as well, because that profound quote, Nigel, of seeing choice, that when someone says, someone does something to me, and before I respond, the more in control I am of being able to see the space and fill the space with something that's going to be positive and profound and meaningful, may be one of the most transformative ideas that any human being has come up with. The second idea that I often frequently share his quote is the second one, where he said, "The Germans could take away all of the last of a man's human freedoms but one, the freedom to choose one's own way, one's own attitude, regardless of circumstance." And I find that is secondarily to be enormously profound as well, that a lot of my suffering is what I do up in my head. Yeah. And if I create my suffering, I also have the capacity to create joy and happiness for myself.
That's great. And we've got a lot more to cover. I do know there's some questions that are coming in. Maybe it'd be a good opportunity, Natalia, to see what questions.
So we have a question, we have a comment / question that a few people kind of upvoted, so they would like you both comment on this. So someone shared the sentiment that, and that goes back to that diagram about fear and learning, and it seems like it touched a lot of people. So someone is saying that they personally didn't experience fear And they jumped right in, and they saw this as an opportunity to be part of history and something, contribute to something that's bigger and make a difference. And now as they return to normalcy, they find being more depressed and feel unimportant. Yeah. And they feel like no one else really identifies with that. And they look at that as being strange. So the person is asking, does that make me strange, a strange person? So, and 4 people actually now endorsing the question. So I guess. Yeah.
I want to thank that person for having the authenticity and the vulnerability to share that profound question, because I think it's real, and I think it's substantive. And as I reflected back on the POW experience, while they came out of it dramatically transformed, I also know, in having read many of their stories, that it would be very human to wake up and realize that you are, for all intensive purposes, in hell. And there were days that just to breathe was hard work. So I think it's incredibly human, and I think many of us are going to have these experiences. In my interaction with many of the Ochsner leaders, the crisis where that clear and present danger is with us, it's very easy to find meaning in the midst of that. And now, as we go back to the ramp up campaign, it could easily fall back into what is my role? And so one of my challenges for all who are listening, one of the most important things that we may get out of this experience, how long it lasts, is to make sure we have a powerful sense of meaning and purpose beyond our own self-interest. I feel so privileged to even be here today, and being asked to be a part of this. And so for me, this is my sense of finding meaning and purpose. I love when I talk about the importance of clarifying our purpose and meaning. I love to describe this marvelous statue of Michelangelo's last statue in Milan, and it's not even finished. But I love to show the statue only because Michelangelo was carving that 2 days before he died at the age of 88 in the year 1564, when the average life expectancy of an Italian male was under 30. And so I have to believe that what gave this man such fuel for life was waking up with a sense of purpose. And so I challenge everybody on this call in as we go through the next 12, 18 months, finding what's your purpose, and how do you attach as much passion around that service and purpose as possible.
My colleague John Sawyer sent me an article, I think 3 days ago, and it's only 4 or 5 days old. It appeared in Harvard Business Review, and the title of it was, "If you feel like you're regressing, you're not alone." And it sort of talks about these 3 phases. What phase 1 was, but it was like the purpose phase. And then there is this regression phase, and it's how do you transition that? It is normal. How do you transition out of the regression phase and get into the recovery phase? And I'd maybe to Natalia at some point we can sort of look for that and provide it to the folks on the.
Nigel, one of the analogies that's making its rounds is, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I actually don't like that analogy, because even as hard as a marathon is, it's got a start and a finish.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't really know how long a race we've got to run. And so if you don't know how long you've got to run, what all of the literature, not only on resilience, but in post-traumatic growth, tells us is we've got to be even more intentional about self-care. And one of the most important elements of that self-care is that there is a time to push and perform, and there's got to be a time to recover and renew and rejuvenate.
Yeah.
And if we don't put as equal attention into that renewal as we are in the performance, I don't care how strong a person you are, eventually your body and your brain will break down.
But that sort of transitions into, and we'll get back to the questions in a bit, but into the this ingredient you talk about for post-traumatic growth, and that is self-care. Do you want to expand on that? What are the different elements of self-care? Certainly recovery is a huge component of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
As I was digging into the literature and preparing for today, one of the things that stood out for me for how to go through self-care was not self-care at all, but care in conjunction with the support of a community. And so if you read the literature on post-traumatic growth, one of the enabling practices is actually disclosure. And just as that person who asked that question had the courage to go, you know, the first couple months of this, I had no fear. And now as we're going in sort of this next phase, and we're trying to wrestle back to, you know, some semblance of normal, it doesn't feel the same. And so what the literature, the research shows is having a supportive community where I can bear a bit of my own, you know, sense of regression or struggle. And for that struggle and vulnerability to be received with open arms, with equal vulnerability, and you know, here's what I'm experiencing. So, you know, one of the elements of self-care is, you know, have the freedom to sort of name what you're experiencing, and to give yourself some grace that it's okay and very human to struggle as we're all wrestling with, you know, how do we get life back to, you know, I grieve sometimes frequently about life in February was phenomenal.
Yeah.
I was on my way to one of my best years. And so I grieve that from time to time.
Yeah, the week of Mardi Gras, which just preceded things here in New Orleans, I had my 23-year-old daughter and you know, 10 of her friends down from Virginia, and it, you know, just the juxtaposition about that week and the level of joy that week, and then just things evolve so quickly.
Yeah. So that you know, the self-care is multidimensional. If you know, if I were had a former POW on this call, one of my dear friends, his name is Lee Ellis, and I really challenged him. I said, you know, give me a sense of what were the things that you guys did that made the biggest difference. And he said, first and foremost is in 1969, they moved most of the POWs out of these small little prisoner of war camps up to the Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam. And so he said one of the happiest days of his life is he went into a cell with 50 other comrades, many of them who he knew. And so senior leadership was keen to say, we're not going to wallow. We're not going to, you know, use this time to think about how angry we are, how resentful we are, how bitter we are. We're going to work on ourselves. And so we're going to have physical fitness. You know, every POW's got to learn to walk 20 miles because we never know if someone breaks us out, how far we got to walk. And Sunday and Wednesdays, we're going to have chapel services, and we're going to create a university not using any books, pencil, or paper. And so whoever was the keenest on French or algebra, they would become a teacher and then have to put together an undergraduate course for their colleagues. So there was all of this mental stimulation. And so, you know, my challenge to anyone listening is, you know best what are the self-care things you need to be at yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I challenge you to carve out, you know, it doesn't have to be a lot of time. There's tremendous research that on meditation that all you need is 8 to 10 minutes a day for it to be life-giving. There's a beautiful book on exercise called Spark, the Revolutionary Science Between Exercise and the Brain. And John Rately, the psychiatrist who's the author, you know, talks about high intensity interval workouts of 15, 20 minutes being some of the most productive workouts you could ever do. So what I'm learning is it doesn't have to be a lot, but it has to be intentional about making sure I am finding ways to recover renew. Like mindfulness, it doesn't have to be meditation, it can be prayer. But whatever can give you stillness and a sense of peace and a sense of calm in the midst of the chaos.
Yeah. I'm thinking about your description of the university or schools without books, exams. I think my children would like that. Why don't we take another pause? I'll defer to Natalia about any questions that are.
So I think we have an interesting question that would probably help us connect and move into the relationship space, and what some of the stories that you told us about that you learned from the prisoners of war. So the question is about storytelling, and someone is asking, and a few people endorsed the question: how can storytelling help our employees move forward post and during COVID times? What is the best format for storytelling, and can this become a positivity bias? Can we use that to?
Oh, that's beautiful. So I have two thoughts about that. The first thought is, I have been staying on social media as it pertains to Ochsner and the amount of heroes that are being recognized. My view is let's do even more efforts to sing the praises and to tell the stories of the thousands of people who've stepped up, and I think it behooves leaders across the system to make sure we're doing everything we can, to not only tell the stories, but to allow others in their own words to tell the stories. So I would put, I know resources are greatly constrained, but I would make that an important aspect, because I know, as I've talked to many about their Katrina experiences, as I would hear those stories, the amount of deep pride and connection to the organization. I think the way Ochsner has stepped up and is stepping up for all of the state of Louisiana and in the Gulf is amazing. So I think we have to keep telling those stories. But I've got another aspect of storytelling that's important, and it's our personal stories. Is just as I showed that from fear to learning to contribution, one of the questions that I sort of initiated that framework is, who do you want to be during this pandemic? And I think one of the most important stories that we begin to create is, who do I want to be post COVID-19? And if you look at people who have engaged in great transformation, there's usually two stories. There's an old story pre-trauma, and there's a new story post-trauma. And I challenge people on this webinar to, what's your post-trauma story? Who again, what does the best version of you look like? What's the best version of the quality of your relationships? What's the best version of whatever you value most in life? What would it look like to have a keener appreciation and a deeper sense of strength and a renewed sense of what's really important in life?
I agree, Greg. I think the power of storytelling is huge. I moved to New Orleans just after Katrina, and I'll even share that I was a little envious about all the storytelling that was going on about what happened here, but it did instill this incredible sense of durability and pride in the organization. And we also tell stories about our founding fathers and the courage to move away from a traditional university practice, and I think that sense of history and being able to get through things is incredibly important. And I do love what you just said. This is going to be a defining story for many of us. And when we look back 3 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to ask, what did we do, or how did we contribute during that story? Yeah. And I think that's going to be very powerful.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
Natalia, one more question before we move on.
I think we can move on, and
Okay.
there are lots of questions and comments, so let me sort through those as you move along.
You bet. So moving on to this next sort of ingredient, for post-traumatic growth, and that's being relational or relationship building. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and how do we make that real? How do we put that into place?
Yeah, one of the things that has greatly impacted me is this magnificent study done by Harvard called the Harvard Study of Adult Development, where back in 1938 that they had this mindset of working with these 724 young men, and what would they discern and discover by following these lives, right until their deaths. And so this study actually continues. It's studying the children of the first 724 men. There have been 4 study directors, and the last 2 have given TED Talks or written books. But I'll give you the Cliff Notes. And the Cliff Notes is this, is that the most extraordinary discovery of studying human beings for that long period of time is that what really matters in life is not fame, not fortune, not title, not stuff. It's actually the intimacy and the quality of your relationships. When you look at people who are on their deathbed and they have regrets, it's not, I wish I had more stuff. It's, I should have loved more. I should have reconciled with so-and-so and so-and-so. So, what my research on post-traumatic growth has also informed me and taught me that one of the most important ingredients to get through hard times and difficulty and struggle is instead of pulling back in, it's to extend out and reach out to my family, my friends, and to broaden those group of friends. I often use this very simple sort of metaphor of 4 categories of friends. There's the must friends, and what the research shows is the more friends you have that you can call at 2 a.m. who will drop everything to come to your need, you actually live longer and have a healthier life. So must friends. And then the second category is the trust friends. That you may not call them at 2 a.m., but you still know you can count on them when they speak their truth, etc. And then there's rust friends, those old friends because of where we were in life that we may have lost touch. And then there's just friends. And I often think that this time of crisis and challenge is an opportunity to sort of move some of my rust friends to trust friends. Maybe it's an opportunity to move 1 or 2 of my trust friends to must friends. And maybe there's an opportunity to go back into the well of the just friends to move them as well. So yeah. I think it's about being intentional about what are the quality of my relationships and what could I do to make them even stronger and more vibrant as a means of inoculation, but also as a means of transformation.
Yeah. I love this concept of giving rather than taking. I think, in order to improve the quality of relationships, you really have to be a giver, rather than a taker. Something you said one of my colleagues, Chip Sternberg, is a vascular surgeon, and he gave a great talk I saw somewhere. And he talked about his mentor, who said he'd never met a vascular surgeon on his deathbed who said, I wish I'd done more aneurysm repairs during me. So, it's all about reflecting on the richness of your connections during your life. Mm-hmm. And then something you said, and Greg, you'll have to correct me. I remember reading a New York Times article about this town in Pennsylvania, and the longevity, in this town was like into the 90s.
Yes.
And when they looked at this town, it's like 90% of them had come from this small town in southern Italy. And the conclusion was the key to their health was the richness of how these folks socialize with each other, the morning coffee, the discussion. So, mm-hmm. That really struck me as well.
Yeah, and sad follow-up on that little town is that as they went back to survey, their longevity went back to sort of whatever the normal surrounding communities were. So the culture of where that town was nestled in Pennsylvania, unfortunately, actually diminished some of the practices that they had brought from, I think, Sicily or southern Italy in terms of community. in the blue zones, the places where people live, scientifically proven the longest, of the 9 sort of common elements of what do those societies and cultures and communities do differently. 3 of them have to do with relationships, that there is a family first mindset. Secondarily, there's a circle of must friends that you spend time, you prioritize effort and intention around. And then around those must friends are another circle of whether it's your church, your Rotary Club, that wonderful Cheers song for the sitcom, a place where everybody knows your name, and that when you're missing, people go, "Where have you been? We're not the same without you." So I think one of the most important things we can do to make sure that this experience and crisis does not go to waste for our own personal transformation is seeing this as an opportunity to reach out to old friends, reach out to new friends, and deepen those friendships.
And just to challenge you a little bit, I think that's where this whole physical distancing and social distancing has been a challenge. I mean, I think we're finding new ways to connect, but that has been a bit of a challenge for some.
It has been. I completely agree. And I think because of the challenge of the physical distance, I think it behooves us to be even more intentional about, okay, given that constraint, what are things that I can do to work around that constraint?
I'll tell you, it has certainly highlighted the importance of family, though. Really getting to know, your immediate family and in very, very positive new ways, rich ways that may not quite have existed the same way before 2 months earlier. Maybe we could transition to, and we've hinted at it earlier in our discussion, meaning and purpose. I mean, many of us are seeing such tragic events that the only way to really process that and move forward is to find meaning and purpose in our work. And I think, I hear this term essential workers, non-essential, and that sort of rubs me the wrong way. Maybe you could talk about, for those that may not be patient facing, how do you find meaning and purpose in this environment?
Yeah, I think it's a profound question and of such immense importance that I think one of the key tasks of leadership in this time is to make sure every single person that works for you has a line of sight of what they do matters. So our job as leaders is to help others make meaning of the work they do, so that we get rid of this work of whether you're essential or non-essential. And my view, especially given the resource constraints, that if you're not doing work that adds value, you better figure out how to. But again, I think leaders have to assist in that process and to make sure people have clear line of sight that what you do adds to the value in what we do as an organization in supporting our mission to the patients we care for, the communities we serve. So I think that may be one of the most important challenges in the days and weeks ahead, to make sure people have a keen sense that they matter, that their perspective needs to be heard, that the work they do has dignity and value. I mean, I'm often talking about how as a society, we have to walk this razor's edge of protecting society from a second wave and from getting COVID-19 in the present. But we also have to find ways, how many people couldn't pay their rent. I read something in Atlanta where I live that the month of May, the percentage of Atlantans who couldn't pay their rent is like, it's very, very high and critical. And how are we going to help them if they're unemployed? And so I think there is a deep sense that work should give us dignity, that when we're doing something meaningful and that has value, it provides something really important for us.
Yeah. And I think Ochsner does a great job in our communications, highlighting the work and the importance of the work. Many of our employees that aren't, traditionally patient facing. So, and I think you're right. It's part of the, it's on the organization, I think, to communicate the importance and give dignity to the work of everybody.
One of the
quote, the custodial staff at NASA, when asked, what do you do here? And what was the answer, Greg?
Help putting a man on the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I want to speak one more element of what I've learned from the POW experience is one of the most transformative ideas was that they came to believe that part of the most significant meaning of the experience of the trauma of being, having all of their liberties taken away was to make the trauma and challenge be an instrument of transformation for them. And I just, a beautiful quote from one of the POWs who spoke to that says, "For out of the miseries that we experienced had come great strength. Out of the suffering had come great compassion. Out of the hate came great love. If nothing else, I would come home a better man than when I had entered here. Life would be more meaningful in every aspect from now on." So part of their meaning making was to make sure that they were, again, this is an overused analogy, don't waste a crisis, but to see, I'm reminded of your system chair of cardiology, Chris White, at the beginning of this thing. He said, "Greg, I can only imagine the incredible growth that's going to come for Ochsner." And I go, "Why, Chris?" And he goes, "Well, because we're going to be so challenged. And it's only through great challenges do we experience immense growth." And when he shared that with me in early March, and I've had a follow-up conversation, he still speaks with those kinds of words. And as he reflects on his experience at Ochsner, he's already seen massive amounts of growth. And so I challenge the listeners again, who do you want to be, not just in COVID-19, but who do you want to be post-COVID-19? And what are some of the things that you can put in place, the practices, the habits that are going to help you be, a better human being, a better father, a better spouse, a better colleague, a better doctor, whatever it is, that there's an opportunity to have this better version of yourself because of what you have struggled through and overcome.
Dr. White oversaw a lot of our redeployment efforts in the critical care units. And I think you talk about growth after COVID. And one of the things we've seen is that in putting together these teams, a lot of the traditional silos and hierarchies that exist, amongst physicians, you've got surgeons, proceduralists, medical specialists, primary care, and even hierarchies that exist within nursing staff. All of those, were completely kind of shattered. And I think emerging from that is this sort of closer sense of teamwork, or how you relate to different members of the care delivery team.
Absolutely.
Brian Moore, who I interviewed a few weeks back, talked about being redeployed into one of the critical care units, and he was reporting to an intensivist who was in his first year out of fellowship, and he thought it was just great, that it didn't matter, we were all there to support each other. So, and I hope we can capitalize on that going forward for sure. Going back to the POWs, and maybe one of the last ingredients for post-traumatic growth, and that is this idea of letting go eventually. Maybe you could just say a few words on the importance of that.
Yeah, when I challenged my friend Lee Ellis to say, what really happened there to create such incredible wisdom and enlightenment from such a traumatic experience. And he said one of the most important things that leadership dictated and mandated was that part of our work here until we ever got released. When that would be, we wouldn't know. But it is one of the ways we had to prepare ourselves is to let go of our bitterness and our anger and our resentment towards our captors. And you know, he says, you have no idea, which I don't, how hard that would be to someone who had tortured you. And the North Vietnamese got very creative and clever at breaking you down. But the leadership said, if you get released and you're still hanging on to that deep sense of bitterness and anger, you may physically be released, but you are still in captivity. And so, you know, my friend Lee talked about what they did, you know, to disclose to one another some of the feelings they had, and to work through those feelings, to name those feelings. And what's remarkable is you talk to Lee about his friendships with some of his prison, you know, comrades. The closeness and the intimacy of those relationships is almost unmatched by any other relationships I've seen. And I attribute it to that hard work they did for many of them as young men to work on themselves and to, you know, and if you're telling me a story where, you know, you're telling me you're not impacted, you know, my job was to challenge you and say, come on, Nigel, you're so full of crap. You know, to be really authentic, to be really vulnerable, to really be intimate. You know, a lot of pilots many of these men were, that wasn't natural behavior. You know, the natural behavior was, I'm going to have my mask and my armor that Brene Brown talks about, being armored up. And one of the hardest things is to let that armor go. And they had to do that in order to let go of the things that were, you know, emotionally negative, so that they could accentuate the positive.
Yeah. Natalia, let's break there and see if there are any questions that you.
Yeah, it's great. People are resonating with everything you say, and they have a lot of sentiments and thoughts and that they're sharing. Sometimes they're shaped as questions. Sometimes this is just, I think, and I'm struggling whether to dismiss that because it's just a beautiful comment. So I'm just going to go through several of them. And again, some of them are just sentiments and some of them are just questions. So let's think about building, go back a little bit about building relationships. And someone is asking, Mrs. Parks is asking, what are the best practices do you think in building the sense of relationships or circles with teams that are now working remote? They're not in one and the same space. How would you go about building interconnectedness in this type of environment?
Yeah. One of the slides that I draw from when I sort of talk about deepening our social bonds is I use the acronym HAVE, H-A-V-E, relationships, and H stands for humility, and that humility is about being able to sort of make the relationship not just about serving me and my needs, but making sure that it's life-giving for those who are in my circle or those who are in my team. Additionally, I think there is something happens when we feel accepted for who we are. So how do we create some dialogue around acceptance of understanding your strengths and you understanding mine, but having the vulnerability then to talk about what we're struggling with and through. And I think ultimately, one of the most important things is empathy. I know many of you may have seen those beautiful Cleveland Clinic empathy videos where a camera follows the, patients and staff, and you're able to sort of see what's really going on in people's lives. And what those short commercials are powerful at is reminding us that we don't know what people's stories are. We don't know what they're really going through. So my recommendation, it's hard, but we've got to focus on the work. But I also think we have to equally focus on the relationship and creating space and time for us to talk about, what's really going on for us. I mean, I would love to see relationships move down the path where the one person who'd asked the question about, I didn't feel any fear, and now some of it is bubbling up. I hope there's a place of safety that you could bring that question to your colleagues so that you could get back some empathy and vulnerability from some of your colleagues. So great relationships do require a two-way street, but I think this formula of humility, acceptance, vulnerability, and empathy is a good pathway. And I challenge you to sort of take some time to carve out some authentic dialogue around some of these elements.
I think it is quite powerful when it is possible to get to know some of your teammates outside the context of the work that they do. I mean, when you see a colleague and you see them, you know, with their family, or when you see them doing something else, I think it's very powerful to be able to understand that colleague as a role, as a father, as a child, as a husband, as a wife. And I think that's important. I think in this new era, you know, with physical social distancing, I just have to give a shout out to actually my wife, Shelley, works for Ochsner in business development and has been working remotely, but she's found very creative ways to connect with her teammates. There's all sorts of kind of apps out there. I can't even name them, but she's, I think, done a great job with her teammates, sort of continuing and strengthening relationships in this new environment.
Yeah, and one thing I just may, I think because I have a couple Zoom calls now that I didn't have with all of my siblings, with my own kids, and then I have some Muss friends that we're doing a Zoom call tomorrow night, and I think it's easy just to sort of stay at the surface of how are you doing? I'm fine. How are you doing? I'm fine. I think it takes real courage to sort of what I call plumb the depths, to go, no, what's really going on for you? And let me lead the way. I just have to share with you, you know, some of the emotions that I've experienced over the last couple days. I think it takes courage to sort of move relationships so that they're not pseudo community, but real community.
I agree.
So we have another,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, another thought or a question around this topic of connectivity or being alone or feeling lonely. And so I'll let you listen to the question. So do you have any thoughts on the younger generations who have less social connectivity despite the many social connections tools, and how they're processing this situation? So, and they're saying that they're processing slightly different than the others. Do you agree or disagree? And then it sounds like this person is, they're being a millennial. I'm used to living life quite alone. I have friends and family, but still being single at 30 and traveling a lot for work. My life has become more isolated. I'm curious to know if there are certain data points on my generation and others, and their potentially different experiences during the quarantine social isolation. I feel I'm actually more able to accommodate being socially isolated than many others, but that might not be a good thing. So what are your thoughts on that? So there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it's bringing to light, and it's a fabulous question, and I deeply appreciate the courage of the person asking it, because I don't think they're abnormal. I think it's normal, as we have replaced over the years real community with pseudo community in terms of Facebook friends and LinkedIn friends and Instagram friends. And I think it has created actually greater social isolation. So when you throw on top of that the need to physically distance, it can create the circumstances which the person asking the question posed. And so my challenge for all of us is, if the research is unequivocal that the most healthy places in the world put so much emphasis on real community, real connection, real relationships. You know, most of these places, like the island of Sardinia, the Nicosia Peninsula in Costa Rica, the Greek islands to include Acaria, the Seventh-day Adventists out in Loma Linda, California, and the Japanese women on Okinawa. You know, they don't have deep relationships built on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm not saying it; those tools aren't wonderful, but don't let them be your vehicles for real human connection. And so my challenge to all of us is, you know, who are in my circle, and I may need to be intentional and put tremendous effort to make sure I've got a circle of friends that I can reach out to and be real and to connect with. And you know, I'm just grateful that we have this technology, that we're doing this, because 10 years ago we couldn't have done this. I mean, over the last several days, I've probably had 25 Zoom meetings. So at least we're getting some connection here. It's not like being there, and I can't wait for that to happen. So again, my challenge to the person asking the question is, your concerns are real. I think they're shared, and I do believe we're going to have a mental health challenge of many people who are feeling deeply isolated and alone. And we've got to address that. And so I think there's effort on your part, but the organization has a responsibility too, to make sure people are not feeling that kind of social deep isolation.
Greg, you talked earlier about the schools, and there is going to be risk, bringing kids back to school, but there is an urgency to it. I think when you take a generation that is very social media conditioned, you've removed the sort of 8 hours of socialization, and I think there's going to be a fallout from that.
I agree.
And we'll have to see, but I think there is going to be a sense of real need to start up the school system as soon as possible, as long as it's safe.
One thing I did not mention, but it's really important, and I think it's also part of the strength of living in Louisiana. I've often, when I introduce myself to a new group of Louisianans, I always say that there is an alignment between people there that's unique around the 6 F's. It's certainly everyone's all into the Saints and LSU. You love food. You're deeply connected to family. You love fishing. Mardi Gras is a reflection of the cultures circling around fun, so family. Oh, and the reason I'm bringing this up, faith, is faith is such a strong element of the culture in Louisiana, and the strength of so many of the people that I work with and know at Ochsner, and what the research from the POWs is that sense of faith was deeply cultivated and renewed. And if you went into the POW experience with your faith not strong, you came out with it really strong. And so I share that is one of the things that I know many on this call are already in great practice around, but I just wanted to make sure I shared that with you, that what the research shows is that can be one of the greatest tools and practices to engage your spirituality and come through this with an even stronger set of, this is what I truly believe.
And someone shared that, speaking about New Orleans, someone felt that New Orleans probably a little more resilient than any other city because of the history. But the person also shared that they still feel sometimes helpless, that they wish they could have contributed more in this time. So there is that sentiment too, that I wish I could do more in this time.
Yeah.
Maybe we can bring up this would be a good time to bring up the last polling question. And I think we're going to see the different ingredients that go into post-traumatic growth. And maybe we could ask those that are on the webinar to pick one. What are you going to double down on as you move forward?
And I know that people don't like when we make them choose one. Like people would like to choose many, but we're just curious to see, if you had to pick one, what would that be? And while people are voting, there is another sentiment that someone mentioned the forgiveness and forgiving others and yourself is a big thing. So I
Oh,
think that's a
beautiful.
beautiful comment.
Thank you. It is. Yes. Beautiful. Yeah.
While we, again, waiting for the results, someone is asking, can you speak to utilizing faith practices for atheists?
I'll let Greg take that one.
Yes. I think that one of the things is to reflect on how do you define goodness? I think there is inherent sense of what we believe is right and true, and qualities of compassion. And when we see people being selfless and guided not by what is important to them, but what's important in serving a patient, serving a colleague. So I think one of the best spiritual practices we can get into is that of kindness. And I know for me, one of my terminal values that I have to work at it because I don't think it comes as natural as I'd like it to, is extending as much kindness as I can to everyone I encounter. So I think that when I do that well, I am contributing to the goodness of humanity, as if I dropped a stone in a pond to see those ripples of positivity and goodness and compassion and empathy and kindness. Who's going to argue against those qualities? So I think that's another wonderful spiritual practice is just meditating on some positive quality that you want to see more of in yourself, and spending time in meditation and just reflecting on that quality. The Buddhists have a wonderful chant around, may you be healthy, may you at peace, may you be of great health, and just keep practicing that over and over again, and directing that at friends, maybe directing at a neighbor who's cantankerous. May you be kind, may you be healthy, may you be at peace.
So we've got our poll results up, and sort of a relatively equal smattering of all of them. I think 1 in 4 say that we're going to double down on focusing on self-care. But that's sort of interesting, not necessarily surprising when I think about my own views on this. It'd be hard for me to pick one.
Yeah.
So Greg, as we transition to the end of our webinar, do you want to maybe give me what you think your top 2 to 3 key takeaways for the audience, as they move forward through this?
I'm going to take you to your summary slide. That's
Yeah, I just one final quote from just when you understand and read the POW story. It says that their tale could seemingly be a sad one. How could it be anything other? Without question, it's a tragic story if you reflect on the brutality of what they experienced. But more than that, it's an inspirational one. For every account of unspeakable atrocity, there are several of heroism and selflessness. For every tear of sadness, there is double that of joy. The towering courage of these men, the POWs, their unwavering commitment to each other, their deep sense of purpose, and their indomitable spirit provide lessons in surviving, coping, hardiness, and the importance of community. Because they have emerged whole, healthy men, theirs is a story of endurance and victory. So I share that with all of you because Ochsner, the work of Ochsner, and I don't care what your role is, you're all essential, you're all important to that great work. You're at the forefront of taking on this pandemic, and you're at the forefront of figuring out how to get back to some semblance of normal. And never in our wildest imaginations could we have dreamed of what we would face. And years from now, we will keep going back of what was the profound impact on this pandemic on ourselves. And I guess what I want to offer you, hope and optimism, is that we know so much about what does it take to overcome and triumph over struggle and difficulty and challenge. And so the tools you see here and the tools that we've presented to you in this webinar are tools that the science and research, as well as the study of the Vietnam POWs teach us. They really work. And so it's a matter of being intentional and purposeful about doing these things, which for many of us, I'm preaching to the choir. I'd be highly surprised if I've offered anything earth-shattering. But you know, most of America's health problems are not problems of knowing, it's problems of doing. So, you know, my challenge to you is, what's it going to take for you to close the knowing-doing gap of doing those things, those practices, and making them habits that are going to help you move through this very difficult, challenging time, so that when we look back, you can see in your own life, you know, the seeds of a massive transformation that I think are available to all of us. So that's my parting message. There's science and research to this, but again, it requires us to do something with it.
Great, and we have a couple of questions. So I think this is a great question. So someone is curious and asking, how can we, starting at the top of the organization, make sure we don't lose the progress that we've made? We've made trying new things, moving very quickly, taking risks, and once things get to normal. So how do we continue doing this? And this is a big question. And the person shares the sentiment that they fear that we will kind of slide back into, you know, our old patterns. And, you know, so I think that's a great question. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I have several of my clients that refer to some of the decisiveness and the good practices that organizations like Ochsner have had to adopt and adapt to. We call it COVID thinking. Let's not lose some of our COVID thinking. And so that's my challenge to Warner and not just the senior leaders, but all leaders and all employees, is what are the positive things that we have had to do in order to quickly adapt. I remember Rob Walterman proudly telling me that you guys added almost 140 new ICU beds in OMC in less than, I think it was 6 weeks. And a project of that immensity usually takes, you know, if not a half year, all year. So there's been a tremendous amount of good things that have been created through this sense of urgency. And my hope is that, you know, some of the ways in which we communicate frequently and transparently, we've got to maintain those patterns of communication. But so I would say the containers we've had to build around meetings and structure, some of them let's not throw away as we move down this path of recovery. Let's keep them in place as reminders of how we have stepped up and through immense collaboration and teamwork, done some heroic and Herculean things in response to and preparation for patients severely impacted by COVID-19.
If somebody told me in February that we could add 120 critical care beds in a few weeks, I would have said that's impossible. So I think as we move forward, there is this sense of optimism that we can do things, that we can be agile. I again want to go back to this. You know, when I went up to Baton Rouge to round on some of the units there, you know, I asked many of the folks what's the positive that will come out of this, and each one of those units said the sense of teamwork, that we know each other better because of this. A lot of the day-to-day drama been ditched in a very short period of time, and you know, I hope we maintain that. I also think going forward, this is sort of a shout out to Warner and his team that put together our 10-year strategy that we heard about in January, 2 months pre-COVID. And those 4 strategic pillars, you know, around being a destination center, but population health, digital medicine, telemedicine, new revenue streams. I mean, that was a 10-year strategic plan that has now become a 1 to 2 year strategic plan. And everything, the importance of each one of those things is completely spot on. And I think it sort of validates, there's been a lot of tragedy, but everything we've seen in the last 2 months, I think completely validates that 10-year strategic plan. And I think we should feel good about that.
Yeah, and tremendous pride as well, being asked by the governor to take up the challenge of testing.
Yeah.
I was with another state's Secretary of Health and Human Services the other day, and I said, well, if you're looking for a solution to test your citizens, you need to have an Ochsner. And it's on the East Coast, so it's not a possibility for you guys.
Yeah. Well, I know we're coming to the end. Natalia may have a few things to add, but I do want to extend my thanks to you, Greg. You've been generous with your time. Thank you for doing this. I've enjoyed the discussion immensely. And I know even today, not surprisingly, but over the past 18 months, I've so benefited from your insights. So thank you for what you do, and thanks for what you do for Ochsner.
Oh, thank you so much.
We are very, very grateful for agreeing for you to coming over today. And I've had a couple of meetings to prepare for this session with you, and in every one of them, I learned every time we have a conversation. So this has been a great pleasure and fun and a great learning experience. And I'm reading the comments, and again, people are resonating and having very deep thoughts and insights, and I hope they continue learning. We're going to share the survey at the end of this session, and we're going to share the resource pack, a one-pager with all the books that have been mentioned today during the conversation, and the links to Greg's book. And we hope we continue learning and continue getting to those outcomes that we talked today about. And it's been a great pleasure and a great learning experience. And we're very humbled to have both of you today. And with that, we're going to close the webinar, and thank you all. And sorry if we couldn't answer your question, but there were just too many, and we only had an hour and a half, but it flew by if you ask me. So thank you all.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah, fantastic. Good to see you guys. Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.